Well, we've spent the better part of the year, at least I have, really honed in on something we call the Home Initiative. I don't know if you guys ever heard about it, but I've spent literally in a variety of meetings and settings casting vision for the Home Initiative. But if you've just come to our church over the last couple of weeks or you're here for the first time today, Home is our long-term resource initiative to be able to set this church up for the future, to make a massive statement to the city of San Francisco that we are here to stay. That while we're so grateful for what God has done in the first nearly 9 years, that comes in February, we'll hit the 9-year mark in February. It's been amazing. I have journal pages filled. We have stories and videos of all that God has done. We are grateful for that, and yet we have been working towards setting our church up for future impact for generations to come. On November 17th, 3 weeks ago, we had Commitment Day. I know a lot of you are still bringing commitments in. Others of you tell us about the new year. All that is awesome. And so a ton of people just came down forward at all 3 gatherings, and other people have mailed theirs in. And I promised you that December 8th would be Reveal Day. Only if you want to hear. Anybody at all want to know where we sit with this? A few disclaimers. Number one, our goal was to raise at least $5 million, not because we thought we could buy a building for $5 million. We just wanted to be able to not be pushed out of the banker's office. Okay? We know that. So at least $5 million. Number two, what I'm about to show you, these are commitments. This is not the cash we have. All right? But with that being said, here we go. That's all, and just kidding. How amazing is that? Not as amazing as the actual commitment. Here's the actual commitment. Blown away. The way that God continues to touch this community. I know my starting point, so many of you have shared yours. But when we come together and go, Jesus, here's what we have. We know you're really good at multiplying. We also know you've called us to this city. We know that everybody's telling us it's impossible. Some of you told me that. But we want to do what we can. And to hear from so many of you about your sacrifice, about your generosity, I think I'm doing you a disservice. You tell me we've done you a favor because it stretched your faith and it's upped your prayer life. And now you're walking this neighborhood praying for what God's going to unlock in the future of Epic Church. Well done. For Shauna and myself, on behalf of our entire family, on behalf of our staff family here at Epic, thank you for rallying around what we all believe God is doing and will do in our midst. I could tell you some stories that would blow your mind. I even got a call. I was writing this past Friday morning. I got a call from a pastor who Sean and I have only gotten to know a little bit. He lives in Houston, Texas. And he said, man, we just want to be a part of that. Our church is going to send you guys some money because we think something special is happening in San Francisco, and we'd love to get in on it. This was after I told him the total. Just blown away. The 3 things I shared this Friday night. By the way, anybody here Friday night in this room? It looks a little different than it did Friday night, I got to be honest. And some of you look a little different. I'm looking at some of you like, wow, you sit so still on a Sunday. We had a volunteer party for our entire teams across Epic. We had a DJ standing in where I'm standing today. Don't write us up. Don't tell the pastor you grew up with about that. But what I said to our team that night, I want to say to you, I think the 3 things that matter most when it comes to what we're going to give ourselves to, I think, are we using the gifts that God has given us? Are we giving ourselves to things that are really significant? And are we doing it with people that we love a whole lot? And for me today, yes, yes, and yes. I could talk about this for the next 30 minutes about God's goodness. I could tell you story after story after story because they're your stories. But my assignment for today is actually to teach part 2 of the Imperfect Origin series. So let me get on with that. Last week we kicked off this Imperfect Origin series Our teaching pastor, Will Maraza, did a fantastic job. This is one of those episodes today. You won't be in the dark by watching this episode, but I encourage you to go back and see how we kick that off. Will talk to us about the generational stuff in our family tree that we really need to know about, because if we don't know about it, if we aren't self-aware, it could destroy us. It could even destroy our children and grandchildren. We all come from imperfect families, and we need to recognize what those things are. And we need to say as much as we can, it stops with us. Even if you won't do it for your sake, we're saying do it for your son, your daughter, your grandchildren, your friends, for this community at Epic, because whatever, we don't have, most of us don't have family that are in the city and living with us close or in this church, but we all bring our family of origin into this community. You know that, right? So just when I'm kind of off, just say, Ben, you must have had a family issue. All right? And I'll tell you the same. We won't take responsibility personally. We'll just say we must have some issues. But what Will said is that even though we have all been affected by the family of origin and what we've inherited from our family, this generational stuff that's happened, we also can be free from all of it. That we don't just have a natural family lineage, but we have this supernatural family lineage, that Jesus can come and he can free us from all of that. And so whatever your story is, whatever your family of origin is, whatever it is for you that you've done to yourself and other people, whatever's been done to you, here's what this series is really about. We believe that there's a reason to have hope, that God can still bring good into your story and out of your story. Anybody need that hope today? That no matter where your story's been, that God can bring good into it, and no matter what's true today, that he can still bring good out of it. Imperfect origins. What do we do with them? Well, what we've been trying to say is we're looking at the lineage of Jesus, and we're understanding that if Jesus has an imperfect family tree, and obviously good came from that lineage, perhaps the same could be true in our lives. And some of us really need a lot of hope around this idea. And if I said to you this, raise your hand if your life is gone exactly like you thought it would go. No one would raise their hand. If I said, raise your hand if you have had 100% of your dreams come true. Anybody? None of us would raise our hands, but here's what's true in this room, and who's watching online right now. Some of us, our lives are actually a lot closer to the plans and dreams we had than others of us. For some of us, we're getting a little bit around them, even if we don't have all of them, but for others of us, not so much. We've all had setbacks. We've all faced a variety of challenges, but some of you have experienced unimaginable loss, and loss is what I want to talk about today. Here's why I want to talk about loss today. I want to talk about loss today because it's in your past family tree and it's in your future family tree. I want to talk about loss today because I'm afraid that we don't know how to lose well, and that's a problem. Why, Ben, is that a problem? Because so much of our future, should God give us many years left on this earth, there are going to be moments of loss along the way. You get that, right? Either we're going to lose you or you're going to lose us. You're going to lose people. You're going to lose things that are valuable to you. Some of you have faced unimaginable loss, but even if your loss hasn't been unimaginable, as catastrophic as other people in our church, you still have lost something along the way, and you are going to lose other things that are valuable to you along the way. Some of you have lost a spouse. Some of you have lost a child. Some of you have lost the ability to make income. Some of you have lost the joy that you thought would be with you forever. Some of you have lost your physical health. Others of you, unfortunately, have even lost your mental health. And for those of us who have experienced loss, which I'm guessing is all of us, and all of us who will in the future experience loss, here's the question we likely have. Is there any way God can bring beauty out of my brokenness? Is there any way that there's a redemption story in my future? Is there any way that God can fill up what is so lacking in my life because of what I've lost? I want to give you one line from Matthew 1. By the way, Matthew 1 contains the genealogy of Jesus through his earthly father, Joseph. I want to give you just one verse there, and then we'll move into our main character study for today. But let me just introduce this person through Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. It just says this: Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. There are only a handful of women, I believe 6 when you read the lineage there, and Ruth is one of them, and I want to hone in on her story and how she, especially and her mother-in-law, experienced loss, what they discovered about grieving, and what they discovered about whether or not our loss will be the final chapter of our life. So if you have a Bible or you have the Epic app on you, all of our scripture for today is there. If you have a Bible app or a Bible with you, Ruth chapter 1, and would you stand with me as I read the first 5 verses of Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And as I read this, I want you just to keep your Bible open or the Notes app open, because we're going to look at a couple of sections of Ruth and Naomi's journey, and I've titled this talk, Life Without. Life Without. Chapter 1, verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. You may be seated. I hope you'll engage this journey. It's fascinating. Let me recommend you reading Ruth's story. You could do that today in about 15 minutes. There's only 4 chapters. It's a fascinating story, but I want to hit the high points today. Can you imagine Naomi's experience? She experiences the death of her husband, and then 10 years later, she experiences the death of not one son, but both of her sons, and there she is. And all we see in verse 5 is this phrase, Naomi was left without. Naomi was left without. Don't miss this phrase. I'm going to come back to this phrase. You're going to see a full redemption story, but you've got to get this front end of the phrase. Naomi was left without her husband and her 2 sons. But for you, I just want you to be thinking about this. See, I know some of you, you've lost a spouse to death. Unfortunately, we have people in our church who have lost children to death. And those must be unimaginable losses, and I can only begin to fathom the pain that you must feel both when it happens and now, because it just never goes away. But even if you and I haven't lost a spouse or we haven't lost a child, we've all lost something or someone that's valuable and precious to us. And it just says about Naomi, she was left without. Do you know what that feels like? Let me ask you this question. Is there anything you thought you would have forever, but now you're living without it? Is there anything you thought you would have forever, but you're now living without it? And I want you to begin to identify this. The only way you're going to experience healing is if you enter into what we're talking about right now. Do you know what it's like to be without? Anybody have a friendship they thought they would have forever? Anybody had physical health that you thought you would have forever? Anybody remember that everybody used to talk about you? You're the most joy-filled person that enters any room, but that's not recently. You know what it's like to be left without joy, you who used to be known as the joy-filled one? Anybody left without the ability to earn income, at least like you thought you would? Some of you had dreams about having multiple children, but the doctor's saying to you, you're probably too late for that now. Do you know what it's like to live without that dream? What have you been left without? What's missing that you thought would always be present? Some of you, when you were growing up, your parents had the marriage that everyone else was envious of. Now, over the holidays, you'll have to visit them in 2 different places. What have you been left without? What have you been left without? As the story goes along, remember, there's a famine in the land, so that's why Naomi originally leaves Judah and she goes to Moab. But later on, Naomi gets word that there's now food back in Judah, and she says to her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, you stay here, you go back to your families, I'm going back to my people. And then you have this amazing, wholehearted commitment from one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth. Not hating on Orpah, I'm just saying nobody calls their kids Orpah. Naomi gets this amazing commitment from her daughter-in-law Ruth, and then they enter back into Judah, and I want you to hear the words from Ruth to Naomi, and then I want you to hear the words from people in Bethlehem as they see Naomi enter the scene, and I especially want you to pay attention to Naomi's words in 16 through 21. So Naomi's like, go back, Ruth, and here's Ruth's reply, verse 16. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. There should be some theme music behind that, Ruth. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. She's like, all right, just shut up. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Do not miss Ruth's commitment to Naomi. You see, you and I, we don't need people in this life with us in case we go through loss and tragedy. We need people deeply connected in this life with us because we are going to go through loss and tragedy. You see, I tell you all this all the time. When more of you sign up for small groups, Lindsay doesn't get a raise automatically. We push this value that life is better, or together is better, because we know that if you get hooked up with somebody, when you go through hell, you won't go through hell alone. We know that. That's why our team, when we got together for our offsite this week to kind of talk about everything that happened this year, for the first time ever, over 600 adults stepped into a small group. See, I'm going to tell you a lot of amazing stuff that God does in Naomi's life, but don't miss the Ruth piece in Naomi's life. Who is your tribe? Who's going to carry you? But Ben, I'm an introvert. I don't care. You're going to lose, and you're going to need some of us to step in it with you. But Ben, I've always been the strong one in my family. You're not Superman or Superwoman. You need people like the ones in this room to carry you when you have carried enough. How are you processing life without? How are you preparing for life without? So they go back and you hear everybody's going crazy. And the women are like, Naomi? Now, a few reasons why you might read into the text that they would ask that question. Naomi's been gone a long time. Naomi obviously is older. But because we know what happened in Naomi's life, she's also probably looking a little less joy-filled than the last time they saw her. She's like, we're going to Moab to find food. She's going with her husband. She's going with her two sons. Could this be Naomi? And she says, don't call me Naomi. Why? Naomi means pleasantness. And from her vantage point, that name no longer fits. Don't call me Naomi. You call me Mara. What does Mara mean? Bitterness. Anybody ever had that journey from pleasantness to bitterness? She's living life going into Moab. Even though there's famine in her homeland, she's concerned about that. She's going in with all that she needs, but she's coming back with nothing that she wanted. And there's this powerful statement she gives. I want you to put yourself into the story. I want you to put yourself into this phrase. She says, I went away full, but I came back empty. I went away so filled up, but I am coming back empty-handed. And don't forget where she puts the onus of that responsibility. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Do you know what that's like? Have you ever entered into something with fullness only to be left with emptiness? Anybody? Some of you entered into San Francisco with a lot of fullness. This was the land of your dreams. This is where you were going to make it big. This is where you were going to have the next I did. This is where you're going to be promoted up through the executive ranks. This is where you were going to be made partner. This is where you were going to find your future spouse. This is where you were going to get a lot healthier because it's California. A Peloton thing might be a good deal now that that rain is keeping your boy from walking 6 miles a day. I don't know. This was going to be the place. But now, no matter what your LinkedIn profile, here's what you and I know. You don't have much to show for it. Some of you remember that beautiful day when you got married. Maybe it was a beautiful church. Probably wasn't a basement church. Maybe it was a beautiful setting outdoors. And at the moment that you said, I do, you were filled with so much joy. But nowadays, when you think about your marriage, sorrow is about the only emotion that enters the scene. Some of you used to believe that you were going to change the world. You had a passion. You had an idea. You had a targeted group of people. You were going to change the world. But let's be honest, you're barely finding a way to survive now in this world. I know so many personal stories in this room, and I don't have to know your story to know that so many of you, you've walked into something so full, only to walk out so empty. Don't give up yet. I've got to finish Ruth's story, okay? So they come back, and Naomi introduces Ruth to a relative of hers named Boaz. And Boaz becomes the kinsman, or the NIV translates it as the guardian redeemer. Meaning that he is able to, at least once he gets one guy out of the way, you know how it always works, fellas. You got to get that one guy out of the way. And he acquires the property of Naomi and Ruth, and also with this redeeming quality, he is able to receive Ruth as his wife. Go read this, but in chapter 4, verse 13 through 17, let's just hit the high points before we leave this morning. And here's what it says. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, I'm guessing it's the same women, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the grandfather of David. It's a miracle that Ruth conceives and gives birth to this baby boy. Ben, how do you know? Well, she's older now, and for the decade that she was married previously, there were no children. And Ruth and Naomi learned something in that moment that I want you to learn in this moment, no matter where you sit today. Here it is. God is still at work in your life, even when it appears like he's retired from working in your life. You need to know this. Some of you, I know you can remember a day when. God loves nostalgia. I think just so enough of it, we give him thanks for what he's done like we do here at Epic over the past 9 years. But he wants you to know something. Even if you think your story's over, I'm not done with you yet. I'm not done with you yet. I know that many of you in this room can remember a moment or a season of life when God's blessing was abundant, where people, even in this room or in other places in your life, they would look at your life and they would go, wow, God must really love you. And you were kind of modest about it, but inside you're like, he must. You haven't asked that in a long time, though, if it's because God loves you. Because every indication of your circumstances seem to say otherwise. I know that you've experienced loss. Here's what I want to say to you. Your story might be filled with tragedy, but God does not intend for that to be the final chapter. Every one of our stories, it's going to include tragedy. But that is not going to be the final chapter. I love what the women say to Naomi. I don't want you to miss this. Remember, the title of this talk is Left Without. Left Without. This baby boy is born, and the women say, I love where they give credit, praise be to the Lord, who's not left you without. Understand what she is saying, what they're saying to her. Understand what I'm saying to you. Was she still without her husband? Was she still without both of her sons? But she was not left without. My guess is whatever you lose in this life, you're not getting back in this life. But you're not left without. You're not left without. I don't care if it was a husband, if it was a baby, I don't care if it was a miscarriage. You need to grieve that, but you need to hear God say, you are not without. And I love so many people play both sides of this, or only one side. We need to play both sides. So many people are like, hey, it's never going to get better, or they pretend like nothing happened. If you don't enter into one, you will not fully appreciate the other. You've not been left without. You've not been left without. She walks into the blessing of God, and the blessing of God is this little baby boy named Obed, who's going to be the father of Jesse. Remember, Jesse was the one when Samuel came looking for who's the next king going to be. Jesse's like, I've got all these boys, what about them? Samuel's like, no. Oh, there's still the other one, little David. And if you keep tracing the lineage, all of a sudden Jesus shows up, which means what? Which means if there's no Ruth going back with Naomi because of her commitment in the darkest of times, there would be no Joseph, as in Joseph, the father of Jesus. Trace it. You're not going to get back what you lose, probably. Not in this life. But here's what you've got to know. God is still good, even when nothing in your life is good. And God is still for you, even when it seems like He's against you. And notice what they say to Naomi. Verse 15, about this little boy. We all know the joy this little boy brings, right? Until you go home from the hospital, and then it's 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. Listen to what they say. Don't miss it. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. If that's just a cursory reading you get, you might say, are they talking about God? Nope. Talking about a gift of God in the form of this little human being. Did you hear that? He will renew your life and sustain you. You're not getting your husband back, but you've not been left without. Boaz was a redeemer. To redeem means to buy back. And one of the things the scriptures tells us about Jesus is that He is our ultimate redeemer. It uses the word redemption quite often. So redeem literally means to buy back. How does Jesus do this? And what does it have to do, if anything, with our emptiness and the losses we experience on this earth? Here's how Paul writes it in Philippians 2, verses 6 through 8 in the English Standard Version. Talking about Jesus, who, though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but He emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. What does this have to do with your emptiness? Jesus empties Himself so that you won't be left empty. Jesus goes through massive loss so that you can go through massive gain. Jesus becomes, if you will let Him, your redeemer, so that one day there is a day coming when your sorrow will turn to joy, your death will turn to life, your loss will turn to gain, and your emptiness will turn to fullness. But you've got to enter the story. And you've got to believe before you can look back and say, oh yeah. And I want to give you 2 ways to enter the story today as the band comes up, just to set the tone for this moment. I'm going to give you 2 ways, and it's not either or. You've got to do both of them. And I don't care what your story is. I don't care what your age is. Go ahead, guys. I don't care what your faith journey is. I don't care if you're a man or a woman, an extrovert or an introvert. I do not care what industry you're in. I do not care how unhealthy your family is or how healthy your family is. I want to give you 2 things, and you need to enter into both of them. Here's the first one. Pour your heart out to God about something or someone you have lost. It's not the time to be strong. It's not the time to go, well, I'm the patriarch or I'm the matriarch of the family. I don't do grief. If you don't do grief, you will not do healing. I want you to pour your heart out to God about something that you've lost, probably someone perhaps that you've lost. And just, if we don't learn how to grieve well, we will not learn how to love well. We will not learn how to live well, and we will not learn how to die well. Pour your heart out to God about something or someone that you have lost. But then simultaneously, let me give you this. Open your heart to God by telling Him you want to believe He is good, even in the midst of what you have lost. It's going to take some vulnerability on all of our parts to do both of these things. So on the one hand, I want you to grieve in this moment. On the other, I want you to declare, God, I'm going to believe that you are good, even if nothing in my life seems to be good. I want to ask you to stand if you want to. You certainly can sit. You can kneel. We can makeshift this altar space. I promise you, if you just come up here and stand and pray, there are leaders up here that we'll put our hand on your shoulder and pray with you. What do you need to grieve? What have you lost? And in the midst of your grieving, what do you need to be reminded of that God has not left you without? One of the greatest declarations that God ever gave us is that He's not going to leave us without. What did Jesus say to the disciples? If I go away, it's for your benefit. Why, Jesus? Because if I go away, I will send a comforter, and He will be with you always. He said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. In Matthew 28, the last thing Jesus said to His disciples, and behold, I am with you always. Psalm 27:1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? If God is for you, who can be against you? If God is with you, you've not been left without. So you step into His presence now, and you, before this year is over and starting next year, you step into a tribe right here. You're not strong enough to carry yourself. Some of you haven't quite lost it yet, but you're on the verge of losing it, and you know that. You're on the verge of losing a parent. You're on the verge of losing your marriage. You're on the verge of losing your job. You're on the verge of being able to not stay in San Francisco much longer, and you need to lean in rather than numb it. God's Spirit is here, and He will heal, but you can't hide. Let's go for it.